Let me introduce our guest. Lots to talk about here. Author and lecturer Webster Griffin Tarpley joins us from Washington. We also have American broadcaster Carol Gould, who joins us from London. Thank you both. Let me first go to you, Carol Gould. Over 2 million people taking direct action against the government's austerity agenda, the biggest strike in 30 years. How would you evaluate this strike?
It isn't the first demonstration this year. We had a demonstration on March 26th of many different groups of people, the NHS, students, and then there were very violent riots in London in August, which nobody has yet quite been able to explain. It did begin with the shooting of a young black man and shooting by the police. And that accelerated it. It became big. It jumped into a giant conflagration with buildings being burnt down. It accelerated at rapid speed. This is quite different today. This is a strike that has been organized for many, many weeks by various trade unions representing what are called public service workers. And I think the reason why there's been quite a big turnout is because there is a general feeling, as you just showed on your clips, of people in Britain, that there are terrible inequalities here, that we have banks and bankers still accumulating money, not distributing money to their savers. Let's not forget savers in this country and in other countries as well, that for several years now, savers have had nothing because the interest rate is almost zero. But the banks are still giving out huge bonuses to their employees and to their executives. And there is a general feeling in this country of terrible inequality. And there is another aspect to this. Sorry, this government keeps talking about all the unemployed people and sick people have got back to work. They've got to get back to work. Well, at the same token, every day we're hearing about chains of shops closing, businesses closing, people being made redundant. I mean, the number of public service workers that they were talking about today who will lose their jobs in the next year or two is close to 500,000. Not all of those people will go on the dole, but that's a lot of people on the welfare rolls. Sir Philip Green, who runs Topshop, the Arcadia Group, he's one of the most successful businessmen in this country, went on TV, and he very rarely gives interviews. He went on TV last week and said he may have to close 260 shops across this country. That's about 2,000 people losing their jobs. So there is a general feeling in this country, even among middle-class people, even among not necessarily liberal or left-voting people, that there is some inequality here, and that this government is trying to crack down on the general working, not just the working class, but all of the workers of the country.
Well, let's look at what the reaction has been of David Cameron there, Webster Griffin Tarpley, who has branded the public sector strikes a damp squib. It's not going to change anything. We are being tested, he said, and we'll make it through. How would you evaluate this reaction? Surely, of course, the government has to respond to what has been deemed as the biggest strike in 3 decades.
Well, you're dealing with a very reactionary Tory government. These people are not conservative in any way. They're right-wing radicals, and they have bet their entire political existence, including the Liberal Party, amazingly, who are part of this, on a savage, brutal austerity program. And the irony of these austerity programs, as we see again and again, is that they do not work. They do not work in their own terms. We've seen them in Greece. We've seen them in many countries. In California with Schwarzenegger. We've seen them in Germany with Brüning in 1930 to 1932. Austerity does not work because when you're in a depression, your budget cuts this year will guarantee that you'll have a bigger budget deficit in the following years. But of course, since these are reactionary Tories, they're interested in their long-term ideological commitments. They want to destroy what remains of the British social welfare state and social welfare network. But now they've had to admit that they're looking at a depression. And of course, the background reality of all of this is that we are in a world economic depression. This is a breakdown crisis. This is not simply a matter of income inequality or adjustments that we would like to make in the name of equity or fairness. This is a breakdown crisis. It's a collapse of the entire society. Will human civilization survive in the British Isles under these circumstances? And therefore, the question becomes, as we've seen again and again, it's wonderful that these unions have come out. I hear that there are some unions that have come out today that have never gone on strike, which is an astounding thing, but there it is.
That's right.
So it's good that they've awakened from their slumbers after all these decades. But what are they demanding? As I understand it, it's mainly demand saying we should not be cut. And of course they should not be cut. But to make that stick, you've got to explain how. Who should pay? There's a depression. Cameron and Osborne and the rest of these people say, oh, the working people, the British working people should pay the costs of this depression and the bank bailouts and the derivatives bubbles and Northern Rock and all the rest. So if you don't want that, you've got to have some alternative means. One obvious thing, the City of London is one of the greatest, maybe the greatest setter of speculative financial flows in the world. Take 1% out of that turnover, not their profits, but their turnover, their buying and selling, and use that 1%, put that right into the British Treasury. Not for the seals, not for the polar bears, not for the pelicans, but for British working people, not for global warming either, but for right now, to save human beings in the British Isles and maintain your social safety net and maintain your pension system, which is, of course, not generous. It's anything but generous. Beyond that, you've got to find credit to relaunch an economy.
Right.
They have the Bank of England. Well, nationalize it.
Right. Well, I'd like to take one of the things you said there, Webster Griffin Tarpley, and that's about the social services that basically this government is, in the long term, in a sense, wants to do away with it. And Chris Bamberry, who joins us right now, he's a political commentator in London. If you can tell us, in terms of these pension cuts, which is part of the larger austerity cuts, which is said would affect the poor the hardest, and of course, with the poor comes the social service aspect of it, of them being the largest recipient of it. What are the dangers there, especially in economically challenged neighborhoods?
Well, we've already seen this summer the biggest social unrest that Britain has seen in over 3 decades, and that's before the cuts really implement. And the sort of community where I live, you're seeing really a succession of blows. People are having to pay more for housing as a result in cuts in housing benefit, which eventually help the poorer people pay their rent. They're seeing their pensions being eroded. This government says that public sector workers should accept what's happened in the private sector, where really pensions have been more or less demolished by employers. The logic to this seems to me that if they introduce slavery in the private sector, the public sector should just accept that as well. But we're seeing other attacks. Where I am, we're seeing the privatisation of key services. In the health service, which Cameron pledged to protect, in childcare, you're seeing private schools being set up. There's a whole agenda here, and it goes by the name that David Cameron gave it of the big society. Big society, small state. And your last speaker was correct. It's an extension of that Thatcherite privatisation strategy of the 1980s, which was a disaster for Britain. As anyone who's sampled British services, British transport, knows that didn't work. But they want to continue down this road because their agenda is they want to make ordinary people pay. Middling people, working people. Because Cameron and Osborne's priority, believe it or not, seems to be the City of London. They put more exertion into stopping the introduction of this Robin Hood tax, or even a tax on gains from the European Union, which has been talked about, than they do in standing up for the poor people of this country. And today's demonstrations and strikes, and these really were huge. For instance, in Glasgow, in Scotland, over 20,000 people on the streets of Glasgow. And incidentally, I think Scots will be considering voting for independence in the referendum next year as a way of escaping from this austerity government. But yesterday they unveiled a further mini austerity budget. And we're going to see more of these because this crisis isn't going away. Where the Chancellor had to admit it's going to be 6 more years of austerity, no sign of economic growth, further borrowing, which we have to pay for, a further 4 years of wage cuts for public sector workers, a reduction in what the amount that's paid to working people on low wages who have children. That's going to be cut, and a further increase in the retirement age in this country. And I think why people were out in the streets today was in large part yesterday they thought another 6 years of this with no light at the end of the tunnel. Where is this country going? It's heading exactly where Greece. And if this government can't turn this economy around with austerity measures, that's the simple truth.
Right.
The only thing that's going to end austerity and this depression is economic growth. And by cutting, you don't get growth. You drive the economy down into the ground. And that's what happened in the 1930s. And that's what's happening in Greece and Portugal and other countries in southern Europe just now.
Well, we want to try to get a perspective on this. Carol Gold, on the one hand, you talked about inequality. And I'd like for you to put these two stats in perspective for us, please, if you can. On the one hand...
Well, I'm laughing. Yes. Sorry.
Well, you can tell us what you were laughing about. Go ahead. Why don't you tell us what has tickled your fancy there?
I was laughing my head off about Scotland going independent ASAP, because I think that might be a very good idea to escape austerity from the government in Westminster. More power to your arm in Scotland. But I also wanted to go way back to what your guest in the United States said much earlier on, and indeed what your guest just now said as well. When you have a depression, when you have hardship, cuts, and austerity do not work. They plunge you into a situation where you get fascism in Italy, Nazism in Germany, and extreme communism. But what happened in the United States was they were lucky enough to get Franklin Roosevelt. And what Roosevelt did was say to the banks, as soon as he came to power in 1933, I'm shutting you down, you take minute salaries, no bonuses, and I am going to create jobs. And what Roosevelt did was start the NRA, the National Relief Association, the WPA, the Works Progress Association, and the Tennessee Valley Authority, and the building of theaters and every imaginable new building across America to create jobs. And he managed to get the American economy going. He was a brilliant economist, and he was a brilliant money man. He also had excellent people around him. And he wasn't an extreme left-winger. He knew that America had to be saved or it would go communist or fascist. And he got America ready for World War II. The United States would never have been able to help the world if he hadn't got the American economy going like crazy by 1940. And that, unfortunately, we do not have leaders like that anywhere. I don't think they fall from the sky, sadly. But unfortunately, Cameron and Osborne, I'm afraid, Ian Duncan Smith, who tells people to get on a bus to get a job, I'm afraid they don't have a clue. And I used to be conservative.
Well, why don't they have a clue? Why is it they don't have a clue there, Carol Gold? I mean, let me ask you this question in another way, in terms of them not having a clue. Maybe you could put this into perspective for us.
Yes.
On the one hand, you have 2,700 people dying every year in the UK since they are unable to adequately heat their homes. On the other hand, you have has come out in a report where pay for directors of Britain's top 100 companies to have risen 49% last year. This disparity.
That's right.
This disparity. Maybe Webster Griffin Tarpley, let me bring you in. We're running short of time. Tell us your reaction there between these two.
Yes, it's a conservative government. 19 members of the cabinet are millionaires.
Okay, let Webster Griffin Tarpley, since he started, I'll come back to you, Carol Gould. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
The idea would be, of course, a new deal for Great Britain, among other places. But the question is, how do you do this? The problem with the trade unions, of course, is that they're tied to the British Labour Party, and that's a bankrupt organization, right? Gordon Brown and now Miliband. Is Miliband going to be the new Franklin D. Roosevelt? I sincerely doubt it. So there's a whole process there. The main thing is to agitate around program, get some demands. Don't worry about personalities to begin with. Get some demands. One of the obvious ones is this Wall Street sales tax, or City of London sales tax in this case. And again, that has to go to the national treasury, not the IMF or Soros or anything like this. The other question is, you want to create jobs, you got to have a credit system. So therefore you need to nationalize your central bank, the Bank of England. There it is. Nationalized means, though, that the credit that you're going to put out, the amount of credit, the interest rates, and the approved categories of lending are determined by the Parliament. That has to go through a public debate in the two houses of Parliament, not some clique of bankers meeting in an oak-paneled boardroom in Threadneedle Street in the City of London behind the scenes.